under a tree. I got a feeling there's a miracle.
Welcome to Broadway Buzz. My name is Joe Gary, and I'm delighted to welcome you to Sondheim on Sondheim. This is a unique review that really takes you into the mind of one of the greatest geniuses the musical theater has ever produced. We're very proud of the fact that the Great Lakes Theater Festival, in cooperation with Playhouse Square, is presenting this unique work. It debuted in New York, honoring Sondheim's 80th birthday, and it would have been a work that would have been lost to the rest of America. But happily, Playhouse Square and Great Lakes optioned the rights to it, and we will be seeing then this definitive review that takes us into the world, the magic, the cynicism, the idealism of one of the greatest geniuses that the musical theater has ever produced, Stephen Sondheim. What I would like to do is to go back and share with you the idea of what a collaborative process the theater is. Keep in mind, every time an artist works with another artist, information, techniques, traditions are exchanged. And so we have an ancient kind of apprenticeship where an artist aspiring to work in an art form, in this case the musical theater, will be exposed to teachers, to people who have gone before him, who will clearly shape his career. And the career that Stephen Sondheim has is extraordinary. But what goes beyond that, the tutoring he had from some of the greatest minds in the musical theater would very strongly impact his work. While the show you're seeing today stands for itself, and clearly you will see into his creative genius in this wonderful and insightful and delightful musical review that you'll be seeing, I want to share with you a kind of structure of facts and ideas and influences that would shape the Sondheim world. So let me go back to the beginning. Sondheim is 82 years old. He was born in 1930. He was born into a sort of upper middle class New York Jewish family. They lived in one of the greatest addresses in New York, the San Remo, which is on the Upper West Side. If you've ever gone up Central Park West, you would look at that building and say, that's where I want to live when I'm rich. And in any case, Stephen Sondheim did as a child. His childhood actually was very lonely and very isolated. He was obviously enormously intelligent as a child, and he spent his childhood really alone playing games and playing word games. His sense of language came to him at a very early age and has stayed with him literally all of his life. And so those brilliant lyrics that you hear that are so dimensional, where you can spend time studying them, they're so complex, those words came from his long love of language. At an early age, when he was a child, his parents divorced, and his father literally abandoned the family. He remarried and set up another family on the other side of Central Park, on the east side, and his mother, whose name was Foxy, was in great despair. They couldn't afford to live in the San Remo anymore, and so Foxy made a decision that would literally alter Stephen Sondheim's life. She decided to move to Doylestown, Pennsylvania, which is in Bucks County, where large numbers of important theater people had weekend houses. And so they moved from the city to this wonderful sort of idyllic country town. And it was there that the young Stephen Sondheim met Jamie, who would become one of his closest friends, and the end result is, little did he know, that Jamie's father was Oscar Hammerstein. And so literally, Stephen Sondheim had so much difficulty with his very demanding and difficult and heavy drinking mother that he really spent most of his childhood growing up in the Hammerstein household. And Oscar Hammerstein, who of course was the greatest lyricist of his day, would sort of take over young Stephen. And from a very early age, Stephen watched how Oscar Hammerstein worked. Keep in mind, Richard Rodgers would come for a working weekend as they were putting together South Pacific, and the young Stephen Sondheim literally sat in the living room as those songs were created and chiseled and shaped and reshaped. And so that early education from a very early age of blending lyrics with music, he learned literally from the greatest masters and really the architects of the modern musical theater, Richard Rodgers and Oscar Hammerstein. So the end result was that as a young man, he went to the opening night of South Pacific, where he met another young man who was interested in having a career in the theater, and his name was Hal Prince. Of course, Sondheim would have a long 10-year collaboration with Hal Prince later, as we fast forward, that would literally not only transform the musical theater, but would give us some of the greatest musicals that the musical theater has ever created. But here we are now, back with this young man who has a love for theater, who's found the perfect mentor to educate him about the sensitivity of lyrics and music. One of the greatest things that Oscar Hammerstein ever taught Stephen Sondheim was that the lyrics have to rest on top of the music. They have to float with the music. Keep in mind, Oscar Hammerstein always wrote, even though they were poetic, they were very simplistic. Think of, oh, what a beautiful morning. Oh, what a beautiful day. I've got a wonderful feeling. Everything's going my way. That lyric would sing with that soaring melody, and it would establish Oklahoma as one of the greatest musicals ever created. So, to begin with, Stephen Sondheim, because of his mother's choice of moving to the country, would literally transform his vision of life, and from a very early age, he understood that he wanted not only to work in the musical theater, but to lead the musical theater. As a young boy, he went to a Quaker school called the George School in Bucks County. And it was a very disciplined school. The children were exceedingly competitive. But it was there that Stephen Sondheim would develop as a musical prodigy. He took piano lessons, and music came to him very easily. Melodies would come into his head, and he was always writing. So the end result was, in his senior year at George, he decided to write a musical that was called By George. And it was a kind of parody. It was sort of cynical, it was funny, it was offbeat, it was caustic, all of the qualities he would have in his later musicals. But it was also a musical that would reflect the school and the people in the school. He made fun of the headmasters, etc. And the end result was, By George was an enormous success. So Stephen Sondheim was very buoyed by this. He thought he would take it right from his high school graduating class to Broadway. So he took the work to his mentor, Oscar Hammerstein. And he said, would you honestly review this for me? And so he gave the work to Oscar Hammerstein. Oscar Hammerstein sat with the piano score, played out the entire score as the nervous Stephen Sondheim waited for the verdict, already thinking about which theater the show should play in. And when it was over, Oscar Hammerstein said, if you really want me to tell you the truth, it's the worst musical I've ever read. Now, if you want to know why, I will spend the rest of the afternoon telling you. And this was the real beginning of Stephen Sondheim's career, where work that he so deeply believed in, and this young, naive, 17-year-old boy had created this work, certainly from his heart, and he thought from his head, but the end result, it was done with very little technique and very little skill. So the end result was the master, Oscar Hammerstein, literally sat with him and went through it note by note, word by word, explaining what was wrong. Stephen Sondheim has said in his memoirs, I have spent the rest of my life trying to digest that afternoon. But it was at that time that Oscar Hammerstein gave an assignment to the young Stephen Sondheim. He said, if you really want to work in the musical theater, you have to do 4 things. Number 1, pick a play that you really love and adapt it as a musical. Do the complete work. Follow the structure of the play, use the dialogue of the play, but structure the perfect musical based on the play. Your second assignment is to take a play that you feel is flawed and work on that play, changing the structure of the play, fixing it so that it could work in the musical theater. and write a complete score. He then said, the third assignment is to take a work that is not a play, that is not written in dialogue form, preferably a short story or a poem, and translate that into a musical, and then finally create a storyline that is original, your own work, and create an original musical with an original story, original lyrics, and music. Stephen Sondheim would go to Williams College, and he would spend the next 4 years of his life literally fulfilling that assignment. And that would literally be his apprenticeship in the musical theater. I do want to tell you one interesting thing. The third work, the idea of taking a non-play and developing it, he took the stories that were the basis for Mary Poppins, and he literally wrote 7 songs for it, and he gave it up because he didn't know how to really finish the work. Ironically, many years later, after he'd become a major international superstar, he went to Oxford, where he taught in what was called the Cameron Mackintosh Chair. Cameron Mackintosh was the great English producer, and he established a chair at Cambridge. And so when Stephen Sondheim was there, he taught young aspiring artists to work. And the 2 lyricists and composer of the current Mary Poppins were his students. So ironic it would be, I would give anything to hear those Mary Poppins songs that the world really has never heard that Stephen Sondheim created. Okay, so he went through this apprenticeship. He graduated from Williams College with distinction. Music played a very important part of his life all through college, and he was ready then to step into the world of entertainment. He lived in his father's apartment on the Upper East Side, sleeping on a couch for several years, playing for artists, making whatever money he could in the musical theater. And finally, he was given the opportunity of writing some scripts for television, and briefly he moved to the West Coast, where he created several scripts for the television show Topper. So why I'm telling you this is Stephen Sondheim really went through a kind of perfect apprenticeship from the standpoint that he sensitized himself to how lyrics had to be written. He sensitized himself to the structure, the musical structure of the musical theater. Keep in mind, by the time he left Williams College, he had an encyclopedic knowledge of almost every major Broadway musical, and he could take every song apart. He understood the 32-measure structure of most of the great musicals of the day, and he could see how all of the great artists of the day had solved that musical theater formula in the creation of their shows. So after he had this apprenticeship, after he had written some scripts for television, he was ready to write his own musical, and he created his first musical that was called Saturday Night. Now, the show never had an early production. The producer of the show sadly died as they were capitalizing the money. Ironically, that show has had a very strange history, just as a footnote. People had always written about it. Critics had written about it. Everyone was very anxious to go back to this unpublished score of Saturday Night and this unproduced musical. Subsequently, in around 1997, there was a production of the show in England. It was worked on, new songs were written, it was redone and presented off-Broadway in New York. So it finally has seen the light of day. Stephen Sondheim says about that show that it was the work of a very young and very unsophisticated artist. It's like looking at an old school yearbook. You look at it with great fondness, but it really doesn't have the soaring brilliance of his later work. So what would happen next to Sondheim would literally transform his life, and it would move him literally into the big time in an A+ way. Oscar Hammerstein had remained his major advisor through this whole period and had supervised Saturday Night, etc. But a tremendous opportunity came along. They were working on a musical that was originally called East Side Story, and it was going to be about the Catholics and the Jews, street gangs fighting on the Upper East Side of New York. What was interesting about the project was that it included Leonard Bernstein, who was, of course, the greatest composer of his day and considered to be the greatest conductor and one of the greatest musicians of the century. It included Jerome Robbins, who was the high priest of Broadway choreography and direction. He would redefine the modern musical with his role as director choreographer. And it also included Arthur Lawrence, who was an outstanding director in his own right, but in this case, he was the book writer. They were looking for a lyricist. The show went through a lot of transitions. Finally, they realized they were making a big mistake dealing with an issue that really wasn't pertinent anymore. The Irish gangs on the Upper East Side had sort of disappeared, and the anxiety between the Jewish community and the Irish Catholic community had abated. But what was really happening, what was happening on the West Side, and of course with the influx of young Puerto Rican immigrants, they would very smartly change the title of their show to West Side Story, and everything started to fall into place. But there was this need for a lyricist. Stephen Sondheim kept saying to Oscar Hammerstein, I really don't think I want to do the project because I want to be known as a composer, not a lyricist. The end result was Oscar Hammerstein insisted that he take this position. And of course, what he learned in doing West Side Story, he would live on literally for the rest of his career. He was working with the preeminent choreographer, the preeminent director, the preeminent choreographer. And the end result was that the process of learning was very intense. Bernstein had to leave the show at a very critical moment because he was also writing Candide, and he had to go and work on that project. So the young Stephen Sondheim, it was rumored, literally changed some of the music and rewrote some of the music for West Side Story. He's never been given credit for it, but it's very clearly been talked about in the theater community from the time the show opened to the present. But what he did do, of course, was have Billing as the lyricist for that brilliant show. It's ironic. It is Stephen Sondheim's most popular show, but it is the experience that he likes least. He felt that the lyrics that he wrote were too florid. He felt that he's embarrassed by the song I Feel Pretty, thinking that he had been too florid in his descriptions and that he hadn't been strong enough in moving character forward. But as everyone knows, it's a classic work. What we most remember about the work was the groundbreaking dance that happened in it. And so Stephen Sondheim swept along with the brilliant success of that show. Other early shows then that would very strongly impact him and shape his career. Another opportunity came along. It was very clear that they wanted to do a treatment about Gypsy Rose Lee that they were going to call Gypsy. They had picked Julie Stein to write the music. Stephen Sondheim wanted to be considered as the composer, and Ethel Merman said, absolutely not, the kid's got no credits, I want an established composer, and so Julie Stein was chosen. But again, Stephen Sondheim wanted to turn down the experience of doing this show because he wanted to compose the show. The end result was, again, Oscar Hammerstein stepped in and said, this is your brilliant opportunity. And of course, what Sondheim learned from this experience was how to work with a star. Madame was very difficult to work with. She was very demanding and very exacting. She questioned everything. Merman was on top of everything. Every line, every lyric, every note was dissected by Ethel Merman to make certain that she would be shown in the best way. As they worked on the show, they realized they didn't have a zinger number to end the show. And how Stephen Sondheim ingratiated himself with Madame Merman was the idea that he stayed up one night and wrote a brilliant song called Rose's Turn, which of course would be one of the greatest 11 o'clock numbers a show has ever had. And for the whole rest of her life, Ethel Merman, squeezed poor Mr. Sondheim to death till his eyes almost popped out, thanking him for giving her that brilliant and defining musical number. It's when the show really reached its highest level. There are critics now who call that the perfect musical. The lyrics for the show are absolutely extraordinary, and it was Sondheim in his prime. So from these two early shows, he was able to shape a career that he would then use for the next almost 50 years of his life. The next show he did then would really establish him not only as a lyricist, but also as a composer. And the show, of course, is A Funny Thing Happened on the Way to the Forum. It's a classic show. It's one of the most beloved Broadway musicals. And very late in that process, so I mean, by this point, Stephen Sondheim had learned how to work with directors, how to work with choreographers, how to work with stars. All of the groundwork was established for a career that would become extraordinary and cutting edge and moving the theater in new directions. But as he was birthing this show, he realized the pain that a choreographer has to go through in making a show work. Everyone felt that the show was perfect when it went on the road. But the audience didn't think so. The audience hated the show, and they walked out of it in droves. One of the things that Oscar Hammerstein taught him was the opening number is the most important number in the show because it frames the show. It lets the audience know who the characters are, what the situation is, and what they're going to be experiencing. Oscar Hammerstein always said, you know, if you have a great opening number, like Oh, What a Beautiful Morning, if you have a number like that, you can have the actors read the telephone book for the next 20 minutes and the audience won't care. They'll be so happy with the feeling of they know where they are, they know who they're with, and they know what's going to happen. So he thought he had written an open number like that, but it didn't work, and they called in everyone to look at it. One of the great directors of the day was George Abbott, and he was an old man by this point, but he was sort of the high priest of directors of the early musical, and he was also known as one of the greatest show doctors. So they brought him in to say, what's wrong with this show? Why don't they like this opening number? It's witty, it's tuneful, but there's absolutely nothing, no applause, and then the audience starts walking out. So George Abbott watched the number carefully, and when it was over, he had no idea what to do. And so his only suggestion was, he said, gentlemen, I suggest you call in George Abbott to fix it. So he didn't know what to do with it, and as the best preeminent play doctor, he was bewildered. So they called in Jerome Robbins, and it was Jerome Robbins who said, nobody understands that opening number, throw it out. You've got to come up with something that will let the audience know what a funny show we're seeing. And therefore, Comedy Tonight was born. And Stephen Sondheim stayed up all night after that meeting and quickly wrote that show. The directors then staged one of the greatest opening numbers the musical theater has ever had. And to this day, we say when we look at the body of musical theater, one of the greatest opening numbers in the musical theater is Comedy Tonight, coming from Stephen Sondheim's first show where he wrote the words and music. He then would have a series of failures. He worked on a show, Anyone Can Whistle, and Do I Hear a Waltz? Both shows were, Anyone Can Whistle closed after 7 performances, and Do I Hear a Waltz had a year's run. He worked with Roger Hammerstein, he worked with Richard Rodgers after Oscar Hammerstein had died. It was a very unhappy work relationship. Richard Rodgers was an alcoholic at that point and severely missing Oscar Hammerstein, and he never felt that Stephen Sondheim could step up to the plate. What would happen after that? Stephen Sondheim would meet Hal Prince, and they would create a decade of some of the most brilliant theater the musical has ever seen. We had Company, Follies, A Little Night Music, Pacific Overtures, Sweeney Todd, and the ending of this whole reign was Merrily We Roll Along. By the time we got to Merrily We Roll Along, this was the only failure that Sondheim-Prince had as a collaboration. And it really brought about a separation in the two men. What happens in a collaborative art like this is if something goes wrong, everyone blames one another. If something goes right, everyone takes the credit for it. So in this case, even though there was a decade of triumphs, keep in mind, the Company is still one of the most revered and loved musicals in the world. Follies and A Little Night Music have been repeated endlessly all over the world, and they've joined the repertoire of opera companies now. So these shows are definitive and defining. So these two men had an enormous collaboration that lasted over 10 years, where they transformed the visual aspects of the musical theater, the staging aspects of the musical theater, how stories are told in the musical theater. It was a very inventive collaboration. But sadly, it ended with Merrily We Roll Along. That is a show I deeply love, incidentally, and it is a show that everyone keeps working on, trying to get it right. Everyone loves the music. It's probably the most popular music that Stephen Sondheim has ever written, but they can't quite get the story right. The story plays in reverse. And you move back to, people start at sort of middle age and it moves back to them being very young. And the problem is no one's ever been able to find the right actors to make that process really work. So it ended a triumphant collaboration. The next major collaboration that Stephen Sondheim had was with James Lapine. And again, this is an enormously creative period where 3 brilliant works were created. And they included Sunday in the Park with George. Keep in mind, James Lapine was a very visual sort of avant-garde director. And so he really pushed the envelope of making the musical more innovative, more visually thrilling in a very exciting way. And of course, taking the paintings of George Seurat and creating this sort of pointillist world on stage was one of the great coups of theater. James Lapine would then go on with Stephen Sondheim to create Into the Woods and Passion, which stands as one of Stephen Sondheim's monumental works. His last success, and I say this in a qualified way, was his play Assassins. It's a very, very dark play about the people who tried to assassinate the presidents of the United States. It has a very dark theme, and people sort of stayed away from it in droves. But people who have adored and admired Sondheim's work find it one of the most challenging and innovative and musically complex works that he created. So there then is this body of work that is astonishing. Ironically, he went back to work with Hal Prince in 2000, and they took a story that was based on the Meisner brothers, who were recluses, and they tried to create a work starring Nathan Lane. It was announced as Wise Guys in 2000. It never did open on Broadway. Several years later, it reappeared under the title of Bounce, and most recently, it has reappeared yet again under the title of Roadshow. But it's not a work that's had enormous success. So what we're left with then is this body of work that is extraordinary. What you're about to see is this brilliant review where James Lapine, who created the work, literally interviewed Stephen Sondheim. So you're really not only hearing about Stephen Sondheim, you're hearing about his work through his own words and through his own feeling. So it's a very intimate review with some of his best and most interesting music. It has a brilliant point of view that only his closest friend could give us. In this case, it was James Lapine, who originally put that review together in New York, honoring the 80th birthday. And now we have it in the hands of Victoria Bussert, who is one of our sort of director superstars. She has directed more Sondheim than any other director. She has spent literally her whole career interpreting Sondheim's work. And so she has put together the material based on that brilliant review that happened in New York, Sondheim on Sondheim. So you're in for a very special treat, experiencing and sharing the mind and soul of one of the greatest artists of the 20th century. Thank you.
Feeling for prose, I even began to compose. Ever since I can remember.